Thank you, Federico, and thank you, organizers. Thank you all for being here still. I know it's still late afternoon, so you might be feeling a little bit tired or hungry, but thank you for being here nevertheless. Consider this situation. We just have an exchange economy with indivisible objects and unit demand. I'm more used to an econ audience, so for this matching audience, this is just exactly the Shapley scarf house swapping setting. And suppose we observe revealed preferences style kind of aggregate matching data. I see the agents, the agent types, and this is meaning that we observe sets of agents who share the same preferences. I'll say a little bit more about this in a little bit. We have houses with potentially multiple copies of each house, and we observe agents, endowments, and allocations. What's unobserved are the preferences. So even though I observe agent types and groups of agents that share the same preferences, I don't actually observe the preferences. These are unknown to me. The central question is this: could the observed economy be in equilibrium? And here I'll be working with the core. Okay, so here's an example of the kind of data that might be seen. We have types. I observe their own house and their finally assigned house, and just how many are in this category. So for example, here there are 3 agents of type 1, meaning they all share the same preference, which is unknown to me. And I observe their own house and their allocated house. I'll just talk a bit more about the setting. I'm really happy with this presentation order because now I can just kind of tell you very little about the core. You already know what it is. In summary, it's group stable. No group would defect and retrade their own endowments. It happens also to be Pareto optimal. And also, there's no explicit prices or transfers necessary for this equilibrium concept. If you prefer, in my model, I'll show that it happens to be equivalent to competitive equilibrium. So if you just want to think about that, you can think about that instead. Just remember, there's no prices or transfers inherent in this model. An exchange economy with unit demand. This really models kind of large discrete goods with fuzzy allocation processes. There's no explicit price clearing the market, but there's some ownership. People can kind of trade their endowments. And this is a stylized version of some important markets that we've already seen today. There's public school assignment, organ exchange, course assignment, and housing allocation. Now, why should we care whether a market's in the core? One, it might be the object of interest in and of itself. We're just concerned whether the economy is stable and efficient. 2, equilibrium might be necessary for other analyses, such as analysis of the preferences. We can use it to form ex-ante predictions for the market. So if we know when the observables are consistent with the core, even before the market is executed, we can have at least some restrictions on what we should see. And there's another interpretation that's a little bit subtle. There's auditability in the sense of Aram Grigorian and Muller. Suppose there is a centralized mechanism used that claims to lead to the core, but the implementer won't tell us anything about it. And we only observe kind of the agents, types, and allocations. If we can find conditions for when the observables are consistent with the core, then we have a way to kind of audit this unknown mechanism with very little information. And finally, more towards economics. This is building on the Sonnenschein, Mantel, and Debreu anything goes theorem. So I'll show you, hopefully, that we do indeed find some real testable implications in this setting. So this is not the same setting as Sonnenschein, Mantel, and Debreu, but it's in the same style. And I'll hopefully convince you that with this setup, it's no longer anything goes. Okay, let me say a bit more about the agent types. This is an assumption that's akin to kind of assuming that the preferences are solely a function of some observables X. For example, it might be demographic characteristics that I observe about the agents. Phrased another way, we can fully condition any heterogeneity away on X. Finally, let me just say that this is a model of ordinal rankings. So if it helps you feel kind of psychologically more comfortable, small cardinal differences are allowed as long as they generate the same ordinal ranking. This is really the identifying assumption that gives content to the question. Something of this flavor is required. You can probably see that allowing full individual heterogeneity makes this question trivial. Lastly, this is really an assumption that's kind of in the style of revealed preferences. And in exchange, I'll get results that are completely non-parametric. So I won't assume any functional form of the utility generating these rankings. Lastly, the analyst has some choice. If indeed there's some observables that are being binned to produce these types, the analyst has a choice between kind of coarser types with stronger implications and finer types with weaker implications. So this is an informal statement, but the analyst is kind of free to choose what they feel the correct trade-off is. Just a bit about the literature. Obviously, there's the matching literature. The model is due to Shapley and Scarf. This paper is closely related to kind of very few things and loosely related to a lot of things. There's Federico's paper, Echenique, Lee, Shum, and Yenmez on the revealed preferences of kind of stable marriage matching. And I'll come back to this if we have time at the end. Here's a preview of the results. I'll present to you a graph construction that's a tractable representation of the observed economy. And I can use this construction to decompose the market into market segments that partition the economy. Since Bettina went before me, I'll tell you that these happen to be the SCCs of the graph that I'll construct. And the results for rationalizability are this. Remember that I observed the agents, types, endowments, and allocations. I'll find if and only if conditions that characterize which market outcomes can be in the core. Informally speaking, it's this. The observables are rationalizable if and only if, within each market segment of the economy, agents of the same type receive the same house. I'll present the formal model now. We have agent types, 1 through A, and individual agents. Just a bit about the notation here. I'm using the first kind of digit of individual agents as the type, and the second is just an individual identifier. So 1A and 1B will be two different agents of the same type. I'll represent houses as the standard unit vectors. So you can imagine the first vector is just house number 1. And an allocation, an endowment, I just observe every agent endowed with one of these houses, and an allocation. This is just conservation of house mass. I'm not throwing anything away or apparating anything. And the preferences are this. Each agent type has strict preferences over the houses. Okay. So the preference here is indexed by I, which is an agent type. Just to reiterate, this means that agents 1A and 1B have the same preference, which is going to be unobserved to me, but I know they have the same strict preference over the houses.
But they can have different endowments?
They can have different endowments, yes. Okay, here's a definition of the strong core. I can kind of breeze through this. But again, the strong core is, an allocation is in the strong core for some preference profile if there's no blocking coalition. And a blocking coalition is a subset of agents and a sub-allocation such that it's feasible, everyone's weakly better off, and at least one person is strictly better off. Okay, so this is the exact same definition as presented in Bettina's talk. An economy is the tuple of observables. Again, that's the agents, agent types, the agents, the houses, endowments, and allocation. So what's missing here is the preferences. I do not observe the preferences. An economy is rationalizable if there exists some preference profile such that the allocation's in the core. And here's the definition of strongly connected components. Again, I'll just breeze right through this. Just so we're all on the same page, a strongly connected component is a maximal subset of vertices such that there are paths between any two vertices. Okay, this contrasts with the weak components because I and J, I need a path from I to J and a path from J to I. And here's just an example of a graph partitioned into the strongly connected components. A general result is that any directed graph has a unique partition into strongly connected components. Here's the main graph construction that I work with. This is a representation of the information that I observe. Construct the graph this way. Each agent is a vertex, and draw an arc from agent ik till all other agents, I prime, k prime, who are endowed with xik. Okay. So I'm drawing an arc from myself to all copies of the object that I receive. The SCCs of this graph partition the market into what I called market segments that only interact among themselves. I'll give you an example here. This is the same example that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. For agent one receives house number 2. So I'll draw an arc from agent 1 to everyone endowed with house number 2. That's 1b and 2a. So I have 2 arcs here. And here's the rest of the arcs. Okay. Any questions about that construction? If you don't get the construction, you won't get anything else I'm about to say. Okay, so it's fairly simple, but it's a little bit subtle. I want to emphasize that this is not really a representation of the allocation. In particular, only one of these arcs would be realized in an actual allocation. But this is representing kind of all the information that I see. Here's the main result on rationalizability. Fix an economy and consider the graph that I just drew. The economy is rationalizable if and only if for agents of the same type, ik prime. In the same SCC, we have that their allocated objects are the same. Okay. And just as a remark, this is easy to check. You can find the SCCs in linear time, where linear is in the vertices and the edges. So if you prefer to just think about the agents, that would be polynomial. And back to the example, the only thing to check here is that 1a and 1b, who are in the same SCC, have to receive the same object. And indeed, here they do. So this is rationalizable. There's nothing else to check here. 2a and 3a are the only agents of their type in this SCC. And 1c and 2b are also the only agents of their type in this SCC. So there's nothing else to check. I'll give you a proof sketch. We've been dealing a lot with ordinal preferences so far, so I'm going to commit a cardinal sin and show you proof by picture. But first, I'll just prove some facts about this graph that I constructed. The first fact is that all copies of a house are in the same SCC. The reason is this. An agent points to all copies of the allocated house. So here again, 1a is pointing to both copies of H2. Every node is in at least one cycle. This is just true kind of exchange economies, of representations like this. So I'm going to call a self-loop a cycle here. 1b is in a cycle, and 1a is also in a cycle. Or rather, 2a is in a cycle. And lastly, the cycles point at each other, since xik is common, and everyone's pointing at all copies of this object. Okay. So that puts together both copies of H2 into the same SCC. The second fact is that the SCCs and undirected components of this graph coincide. Kind of intuitively, what this gives us is that the SCCs are the maximal trading cycles. So I've highlighted here kind of the largest possible trading cycle that can be implemented in this economy. So this is unique. One implication of this result is that when you draw this graph, you can find the maximal trading cycles that are implementable, and this is actually a unique result. I can use this to partition the economy into the market segments, and these market segments contain all the important information that I need. Okay. So here's some of the intuition of the condition. the easiest intuition is just from a competitive equilibrium kind of equivalence. Roth and Postlethwaite and Wacko show that this allocation X is in the strong core. If the allocation X is in the strong core, then it's also competitive equilibrium allocation for some price. The price is not inherent, it's just out there kind of floating, but it is a competitive equilibrium allocation. If the allocation is rationalizable, then it must also be a competitive equilibrium for some price and some preference profile. All houses in the same SEC should have the same price, and all agents in the same SEC have the same budget. So if we have the same preferences and we have the same budget, we should be able to buy the same object. Okay. Obviously, this is an informal proof. Devil's in the details, and the details are in the paper, but we'll move along. A proof sketch of the if direction is constructive. I'm going to find a preference profile that puts the allocation in the core. First, just find the decomposition to SCCs and pick an arbitrary order of SCCs. We're going to assign preferences in this arbitrary order. So in the first SCC, say what everyone receives is their favorite thing. In the second SCC, say what they receive is their favorite thing if possible. This might not be possible because they might have been assigned in the first SCC, in which case, say that's the second favorite thing. There's two important reasons that this works. The first is that if we have two agents of the same type in the same SCC, they receive the same object by assumption. So this is well defined at each step. The second reason is that all copies of the same house end up in the same SCC. So this procedure is well defined across steps. I never have to worry about reassigning a house to a different preference slot later. An argument that this doesn't create blocking coalitions is similar to Gale's proof for TTC. So this is the same example before. I've just picked an arbitrary order of the SCCs. We'll say the left one is first, the right one is second. And I say in the first SCC, the favorite thing is just what they received. And the second SCC, I'll say their favorite thing is what they received if possible. Here it's not possible for either agent because type 1 already showed up here and type 2 already showed up here. So that's their second favorite thing. And this preference profile, you can probably see rationalizes the allocation is in the core. I'll just summarize the results briefly. What have we done? I started out with the question, what are the testable implications of the core in an exchange economy? Exchange economies with unit demand are important and foundational models of economies. They model a lot of situations that are very important, such as literal house allocation, organ exchange, and school assignment. I have an easy to check and intuitive characterization for rationalizability. And this goes on earlier anything goes results. We can check consistency with equilibrium, and we might care about this in and of itself, just for welfare claims or efficiency claims of the market, or we might want to audit whatever process produced this. We can also check this if we care about other analysis that requires equilibrium, such as analysis of the preferences. And we can also form at least some ex-ante predictions for market outcomes before the market's even executed. I have some other results in the paper, and since we saved so much time not explaining SCCs in the core, I'll show you a little bit. I also have an analogous result for the setting with monetary transfers. Basically the same notation. The only addition is that now an endowment is a house and an amount of money, and an allocation is a house and some amount of money. Again, we don't destroy any houses or gain any houses, and we don't, sorry, this inequality is the wrong way. We don't create any money out of nowhere. Yes?
Tell again what the type might be.
That's a good question. So a type, we should think of settings where preferences strongly determine, or sorry, where preferences are strongly determined by something we observe. I think this is actually not a bad model of a lot of situations. So in the house example, say I observe your socioeconomic characteristics, your wealth level, where you work, etc. Everyone with the same observables or binned observables of that has the same preference. So everyone of the same kind of wealth, working in the same, let's say, place, similar job, you have the same preference for houses. And this might be kind of where your house is located, something of that flavor.
But then you are also assuming that same types are eventually going to get the same outcomes. Right? Same types of houses.
So it's
One A and one B, can they have different houses inside eventually?
they can, yes. That is mediated through.
But while you are drawing your SSEs,
Yes.
you actually point out arrows to the same houses from both agents.
That's true. It's not necessary though. There's also a type 1C here who receives a different house. So it's not true that every agent of the same, it's not true that all type 1 agents end up in the same SCC. That's mediated through their endowment. If they have the same endowment, then definitely they end up in the same SCC. But that's, there are other cases as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just briefly show you this result without proof. Introducing monetary transfers and preferences are quasi-linear. There's some utility for the house and just money. Okay. I modified the graph to just add net payments to the arc lengths. So now this is a weighted directed graph. For example, agent 1A net pays $2. I don't know to whom, just pays to the economy $2. And I'll add that to the arc lengths. That's the only change. Here's the main result. This economy with transfers is rationalizable if and only if there exists a price vector looking like this. And this is exactly the price vector that would support this economy as a competitive equilibrium. It's also equivalent to the graph having no cycles of positive length. So you see here, this is actually rationalizable. If we look at every cycle, including self-loops, this has 0 length, this has 0 length, this has 0 length, and so on. So this is rationalizable as well. Again, no time to even kind of show you a proof sketch, but we have these two equivalent conditions. And all the full details are in the paper.
So, so this one is reminiscent of, if you do sunshine governmental, but you allow yourself to observe endowments in addition to where people live, you get something like this. I mean, there will be a 0 on the right-hand side because it's, suppose that I take an exchange economy, a general exchange economy, I observe the endowment vector of everyone and where they end up. You're going to get a characterization like this in terms of whether this can be competitive equilibrium. Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't have any specific thoughts on that right now. Maybe we can talk after. I'd appreciate that. I'll just conclude. Also in the paper, I have an econometric method to estimate utility parameters. So if we observe data that consists of multiple aggregate matchings with the same types, and you're willing to give a functional form for the data, I can also estimate the utility parameters of that. And that comes from a series of inequalities. Stability implies a series of inequalities, which I can estimate. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions or comments by email or after this.
question, I just, tell me one question. That's it. Questions for Anthony?